Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're going to be in Galatians chapter 1, so you might want to be turning there. We'll be in verses 11 through 24, the second half of that chapter. This is part of the scripture reading for this week, and I will go ahead and forewarn you, I usually haven't done anything. The first batch of sermons I recorded Monday, right after I had preached them on Sunday, and so I had already been through it. The second batch of sermons I recorded on Saturday before I preached them on Sunday, so those were a little bit rougher. I'm recording this on Tuesday because I'm about to go out of town for a weekend away, working with a bunch of other preachers in a conference that I have gone to the last couple of years, going to it again this time, which means I need to record this on Tuesday because I leave town early Wednesday morning, and I'm not going to get back until Saturday afternoon. So, if this seems like a very rough draft to you, it's because it is a very rough draft to you. I threw it together yesterday based on some things I'd been thinking about overnight, and I haven't even notated anything. So, here's hoping it goes well. The reason we're going through Galatians is the Bible reading for this church is happening to shift over to Galatians. So, we covered Galatians chapter 1. That's part of Friday's reading. Here we are. I'm covering it now because it asks a question. What exactly is this gospel? And that's the title of the video probably, so you'll be familiar with that. What exactly is this gospel? There's, of course, the very famous condemnation in Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 6. Paul, after he drops his introductory statements, usually has something pretty good to say. He usually says something about who he is. He usually says something about who his audience is, about how God has been working to connect them together, and he says all those things in verses 1 through 5. He then also usually starts out with a positive statement about something that the church has done that is good. But in this case, in Galatians 1, verses 6 through 9, you get the famous statement, "I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you to the grace of Christ for a different gospel." It isn't really another one. You're going after something else. You're letting people disturb you and take you away from the gospel. And so I say this, if someone comes to you and preaches a different gospel than the one you've heard from the New Testament, from the apostles, from Jesus himself, if someone comes and preaches a gospel to you, even if it's an angel, let him be accursed. By the way, it's curious that Mormonism has decided to follow Mormons. I like the Mormons. They're generally decent people when I run into them in the wild. However, the whole point of Mormonism is the New Testament was not enough. There needs to be an extra book. And so this angel comes and reveals a new book to Joseph Smith, apparently. Book of Mormon, whether or not you believe an angel actually came to him or you think that the guy just made it up, either one, it doesn't really matter what you say. Even if we or an angel from heaven comes and preaches a different gospel to you, let him be accursed. If an angel did come to Joseph Smith and preached a different gospel and he wrote that down and taught that in the Book of Mormon, he clearly hadn't read the Book of Galatians. Let him be accursed. Unfortunate. That's why I don't believe in Mormonism. It's not right. It's a different gospel, which is not really another, but it's a messed up version of the real gospel. Same thing for Islam, by the way. The work of Islam came through allegedly some kind of angel or some kind of other revelation to their prophet Muhammad. Again, even if an angel from heaven comes down to you, if he preaches something different than what you've heard, he is to be accursed. Don't follow after those false religions. People get caught all the time going after something else. Either, in their own heads, a lot of people believe that they've seen angels. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. It doesn't really matter. Either way, if the angel tells you to go to the wrong church, that's not something you should be listening to. Be careful where you take your inspiration from, because there are plenty of false gospels that are trying to drag you away from God. So what is the gospel? Right? That's a preamble. I probably won't get into all of that in the sermon, but that's preamble kind of setting the stage for this idea. Paul says they're abandoning the gospel for something else. What is this gospel that they are abandoning? A lot of times we think of the gospel and we think it's just like a part of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's the gospel. Well, No, those are 4 gospels. Those are 4 individual accounts. When you put them all together, they are 4 stories about the same core story that's going on. But it's not just a part of the Bible. It's not just some 4 books that were written a long time ago. The Bible also is not just Jesus's life, or the gospel, rather, is not just Jesus's life. Sometimes we think of the gospel, and rather than say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John individually, we'll say, those are the Gospels together. That's really the gospel message, is the story of Jesus' life. No, it's really not that. The gospel accounts themselves are all focused on Jesus' life, but the gospel is a lot bigger than that. The gospel is, as Paul will argue here and in the rest of the New Testament, you'll see this over and over again, the gospel is not a book. The gospel is not just a story. The gospel is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. The gospel is a real and active force. It is a supernatural force. The word gospel just means good news is the typical definition we go for. What does that mean? What good news is it? It's the good news of Jesus, sure, but it's the good news that God is still active and working in the earth today and on people today. The gospel is the idea of God's power that has come down to earth. It's not from man, and it's not written by man. It doesn't originate here. It comes from God, and it comes to help us. The gospel is capable of a whole lot of stuff, and you need to be aware of what this gospel is. We do God's gospel, his good news, we do it a disservice by relegating it to just a part of the Bible or even just the Bible. The gospel of God has very active effects as it starts in the story, but then it goes into a person and it changes everything about the person. That's what the gospel is it's the message that changes people. And it brings about those changes in a wonderful way. Paul expresses that here in Galatians chapter 1. So we'll start reading in Galatians 1, starting in verse 11. We'll go down through the end of the chapter, all dealing with this idea of the gospel. And I'm reading New American Standard. For I would have you know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel which was preached by me is not of human invention. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former way in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it, and I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when he who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia, and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, and stayed with him for 15 days. But I did not see another one of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now in what I am writing to you, I assure you before God that I am not lying. And then I went up into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea who were in Christ, but they only kept hearing, the man who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy. And they were glorifying God because of me. That's what Paul lays out. What is the gospel? It's more than just a story. You're abandoning the gospel. I would have you know this gospel. The gospel which is preached by me is not by human invention. It's so much more than that. And you need to be aware of who God is. You need to be aware of what God's doing. If you're wanting to consider the gospel, you need to know what the gospel is. It's a lot bigger than you think it is. And when you turn away from the gospel, when you reject the gospel, or when you seek after a different gospel, you've lost your way. Don't go there. There's so much to gain from God, and so little to be gained by losing yourself. So, you can split this section up into 3 sections. I'm still prototyping this. I may change around some of the verses, where each of the verses go, but here it is in general. Number one, you have a claim that is made. Paul makes a claim in verses 11 and 12. What is the gospel? How impressive is it? You see, Paul claims some things about the gospel that he needs to go on and substantiate at a later point. You see him also make a case for the gospel, a case to substantiate the claim that he makes in verses 13 through 17 or thereabouts. You see him trying to make a case for the gospel, and his case study is his own life. And then you see the third section, which is the change that's made. The change that the gospel has wrought, and really the ultimate power of the gospel. It's not just found in the book. It's not just found even in the life of Paul. It's found in the second order ripple effects outside of Paul's life that goes and hits people, that goes and changes people. It morphs what Paul does, but it also changes everyone that he impacts. And you see that in verses 18 through 24. Again, some of the verses may change around. Even as I'm reading that, I'm saying, well, verse 15 is kind of part of the change and not necessarily part of the case. But it kind of is, and a lot of these do overlap, but the point being, there are 3 points in the sermon, at least right now. I'm not sure exactly how to display them all, but that's what part of this prototyping process is for. This is the claim in verses 11 and 12. Paul makes a simple claim about what the gospel is. It's an easy thing to say, right? Everything's easy to say. Well, almost everything is easy to say, such as the gospel is from God. That's pretty simple to say. The difficult part comes in substantiating it, which is why he needs a case later on, which is why he needs to talk about the changes that it makes. His claim is very simple. It's just going to be difficult to actually back up. His claim being the gospel is from God, and that means the gospel is not from man. Paul lays out in verses 11 and 12 a basic dichotomy of how this gospel works, which is it has 2 parts to it. It is from God, but it is through man. This is how the gospel is supposed to function. There is a message being sent, but there's also a messenger who's supposed to carry it, or rather many messengers who are supposed to carry it, and these 2 ideas need to work hand in hand. So you have these 2 ideas. These are the subpoints that I'll explain as we go through this section. Number 1, you need to understand the gospel's origins. The gospel originates from God. You have phrases in verses 11 and 12. The gospel in verse 11, which was preached by me, is not of human invention. Right? Verse 12, I did not receive it from man. I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it. I received it through a revelation, right? And so you have this picture. It's not of human invention. It's not from man. It's received through revelation. The story of the gospel and the idea of the good news is something that originates from God and in God and with God. It's not something that came from here on the earth. Paul has been taught of the gospel, but it comes from the divine. There is no mortal who's sitting in the background making things up and writing down a book about it. That's not what happened. That's not what the gospel is. There are books for the gospel. There are books that contain the gospel story. There are books that contain the good news, the life of Christ, his death, his resurrection, everything else surrounding it. Yeah, we have plenty of books about that. But that's not it. It didn't come through the invention or the imagination of a human being. The gospel came from God. You cannot define the gospel as just those books that men wrote one time. You can't define the gospel as, Matthew wrote Matthew, and that's the gospel. No, the gospel is the idea that Jesus, God in the flesh, would come down here to the earth in the first place, live a perfect life, and then die and be resurrected, rise again, and ascend back into heaven. That's what the gospel is, right? The good news. That's the story of the gospel. And then the change that it goes out and has on the rest of people's lives. It is a story, but it's not just a story. And woe to us if we relegate the power of God to just a storybook that one guy wrote one time. No, there is so much more that's going into this. It did not come up with the imagination of man. Human beings did not invent this stuff. There's something important going on here. And you need to pay attention to the real power of God. Don't downplay what God's strength really is, what the gospel strength really is. The gospel originates from God. That's part of the claim. Here's the second part of the claim. The gospel is carried, or it continues, through humans. This is the gospel in verse 11 where Paul says, "This is the gospel which was preached by me." I didn't hear it through man, neither was I taught it. I received it in a revelation from Jesus Christ. But what does Paul do? He goes and takes the gospel and preaches it to everybody else. See, Paul was blessed to have a divine revelation, to have Jesus himself come personally confront him and fix him and change his mind very quickly and immediately. Paul has taken it upon himself to turn around and teach others because human beings have to be the ones to actually carry out the gospel message. There is a reason. As much as the gospel is not merely 4 written books, there is a reason that we have 4 written gospels that contain the story. The gospel is not only, right, the gospel, the power of God, is not only the story of Jesus' life, but there's a reason we have human beings writing down the story of Jesus' life. Because that's how we can start to share that story to other people. These are good news. It's part of the good news. All of this is essential to the good news. Sometimes, when we say gospel, we think it's just the books. It's not just the books. But in our haste to say it's not just the books, sometimes we say, well, it doesn't include the books. And that's not true either. The gospel includes the books we call the gospel. So the gospel includes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it's more than that. Those are legitimate records of history and the story of God, the story from God that God has revealed to us. But it's not just that. The gospel, the good news, is the effect that the story continues to have on someone's life. These are legitimate human records. We need those 4 books. We need Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to help us understand God. But we need more than that. And that's what the gospel is, the power of God that comes through the story that actually changes someone's life. We have this idea of good news, right? We have this idea of the story of Jesus. But how do people experience the story of Jesus? Well, they experience it through hearing the story, right? They experience it through the written Gospels. They experience it through reading Matthew and seeing who Jesus is, and then they experience it through the change it starts to make in their life. As Jesus' teaching challenges them, and they start to realize they need to change a few things. You see, the Gospel's message is manifest, not merely, it doesn't end with the book. It goes further than that. It starts with God, it comes down through humans. Human work is essential to spread that story. But that's not all there is to it. We'll get to that in just a second. There's a reason Jesus, when he was here on the earth, there's a reason he recruited human beings to help him carry the message. There's a reason we have 4 written gospel accounts that help us to carry the story of Jesus. There's a reason that God always converts, or he grabs people, he grabs converted people, faithful people, and uses them to teach the story to others. It's interesting in Acts chapters 8 and Acts 8, Acts 9, and Acts 10, all those chapters. 3 times over you have this repetition of a command that is arise and go. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, God says to Philip, arise and go and meet this Ethiopian eunuch and teach him the gospel, basically. In Acts chapter 9, Jesus has appeared to Saul of Tarsus, soon to be called Paul, and he's blinded him. Saul is waiting in Damascus. God appears to Ananias and says, arise and go and teach Saul the gospel, basically. And in chapter 10, an angel appears to Cornelius and says, hey, you should go and seek out Peter. At the same time, God is talking to Peter and says, arise and go and meet with Cornelius and teach him the gospel, basically. The picture there, arise and go, 3 times over in those 3 chapters, is curious. In 2 of those chapters, in Acts 9 and Acts 10, Jesus has just appeared to someone, right? Acts 9, Jesus directly appears to Saul. He could have told them the whole story. He could have explained why it's important to repent and be baptized. He could have explained, he could have told them the way to salvation, but he doesn't. Instead, he recruits Ananias for Ananias to tell that to Saul, or soon to be Paul. In Acts chapter 10, you've got the same picture with Cornelius. Cornelius has an angel appear to him, but the angel doesn't tell him how he can be saved or what he has to believe in. The angel says, you should go find Peter. And then God says, Peter, you go and spread the message. God has, from the very early days, even when he was making very, fairly frequent, seemingly frequent and direct appearances to people in those early days, he wasn't just planting the idea of conversion in people's heads. He was influencing them to go and find other human beings who would plant the idea of conversion in those people's heads. God has always worked this way. It's very curious, isn't it? He has always established things with his power, but then called human beings to step up and actually do something about it. The claim here is that the gospel is perfectly consistent with everything else we read about in Acts. It's not just a book. God gave us the book. God gave us the story. Human beings wrote a book to carry the story. And it's up to human beings to take the story out, to give it to other people, and for other people to be able to take that and change their lives accordingly. Human beings are required. We're a part of the gospel story. Because if the gospel is just the 4 books of the Bible, then it just sits there forever. The gospel doesn't continue unless we're the ones who take it out and actually do something with it. When you relegate the gospel to just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and nothing else, you kind of miss the point. There's a lot more to the gospel than appears to be on the surface. The gospel, here's the claim, the gospel is the good news. It is a divine work, but it has human workers to power it. It's not just a human story. If it was just a human story, it wouldn't have any power. But it's not just the divine revelation, because if humans never tell the story, then it has no listeners and no one actually pays attention to it. For the gospel to function, for the real power of God to work, it requires both God and man to work together. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that cool how God just figured that out? Why else does the gospel come with expectations, right? It's like the old recruitment posters for America. It's God needs you to do your part. God needs you to step up and do something for him. There's a reason when you enter into the power of the gospel, when you enter into Christianity, God has expectations that you continue the gospel by teaching it and preaching it to other people. So that's the claim, is a divine story with human messengers, both back then to write it down and now to go out and spread it today. Why should we believe that? Why should we believe whatever Paul's claiming here? That takes us to the second part of the outline, verses 13 through 17, which is the case that Paul makes. We have the claim, verses 11 and 12. Now we have the case, verses 13 through 17. How do you prove what Paul is talking about? Right? How do you prove the supernatural? And the first thing you have to say is it is incredibly difficult, because things that are supernatural are by definition outside of the normal or the natural thing. It's not going to be measurable by a normal kind of metric. Too many people are ridiculous with this, especially bad faith atheists that you see on the internet are primarily the problem here. People who don't even try to understand what God is talking about. A miracle is by definition something that happens outside of nature. It cannot be measured by natural means. But then atheists who claim that, especially the hostile ones who claim that, supernatural doesn't exist, try to measure a miracle by natural means. It fails because obviously a miracle is by definition not natural. It cannot be measured that way. They try to measure it that way. It doesn't work, and so they say it can't exist. No, that's presupposing a miracle can't exist. Presupposing a miracle can't exist means a miracle doesn't exist. Of course it does, because you have no room in your mindset for allowing a miracle to possibly exist. Again, another tangent I probably won't go on in the actual sermon, but it is important to have that kind of background knowledge to understand what we're talking about. How do you understand the supernatural? How do you prove it? You can't use a normal means to prove it, right? The day the sun stood still, there's a claim in the Old Testament, God caused the sun to stand still one day, which would be, of course, modern science, we would say, technically it's not the sun standing still. Joshua prayed for the sun to stand still. He didn't really understand that the sun was the center of the universe and the earth is the one that's moving, etc., etc. So technically it's the earth stood still, but, it's good enough. It worked for his mindset as best he could understand. Sure, whatever. How do you prove that the sun stood still? Well, I don't know, man, right? You look through history. Does the sun stand still today? No. Did it stand still yesterday? No. Did it stand still the day before? No. Or, well, technically, yes. But did the earth stand still any of those days? No, of course not. And so people will use that to say, well, therefore the earth never has stood still. But that's stupid, because the claim is it's supernatural. The claim is God intervened and changed the way things worked. How do you prove that? You can disprove it. You can try to disprove it by saying that's not something that normally happens, but that's the point. It's a miracle, right? It doesn't normally happen. It's supernatural. How do we prove this stuff? Well, it's difficult, if you can't already tell. It's incredibly difficult because we cannot use normal scientific means to actually measure it. There are two primary ways for you to show that there is something abnormal that has happened. And here are the two best ways that I can think of. Number one, you have eyewitness testimony. When people see something that is physically an impossibility, scientifically an impossibility, right? Or at least an improbability. It's something that could not or would not happen, but people see it, and they attest to the fact that something supernatural has in fact happened. That's not something I can measure with the laws of nature, but if somebody's telling me that, what are the odds that they're honest? Well, okay, we can ask questions about that. What if 2 people are telling me the same thing? What if 10 people are telling me the same thing? What if 100 people are telling me the same thing, that they all experienced this together? Suddenly, eyewitness testimony, if you believe people, starts to add up. There's always the possibility that somebody's lying, but the more and more people you have who are all corroborating the same story without backing down or without trying to, modify any of the claims being made, it starts to have some weight of evidence to it, the eyewitnesses that have actually seen it. The other thing that helps to affirm that supernatural events have actually happened are otherwise inexplicable physical circumstances that have changed. We cannot measure the supernatural, but we sure can measure the natural. And when the natural state of something, when the physical state of something changes and there is no explanation, no natural explanation, suddenly you start to say, well, it can't be anything but the supernatural. And that can help to prove that supernatural things have actually happened. Let's take those both and dissect them a little bit further. Eyewitness testimony here. Paul says he saw some things. In verse 12, there's a revelation of Jesus Christ. In verse 13, he used to be Jewish, but verse 15 and 16, God set him apart. He called him. God revealed his son in Paul somehow, and Paul converts, right? Paul says he saw some things, right? There's eyewitness testimony of Paul. And again, how do we know he's telling the truth? Well, it's true that people lie all the time. And so we have to weigh what he said, his words, against the history that we actually have. Unfortunately for Paul, he saw some things, but other people didn't see some things. But there are plenty of people on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9 who, the text even says, they heard the voice. They didn't see anything, but they heard some kind of voice speaking. And after that, Paul converts. His account lines up with everybody else from that road trip. So, interesting. That seems to be some amount of eyewitness testimony. Go back to other things. Paul is claiming to see Jesus. Jesus is dead and gone at that point. Or is he? Because you have plenty of eyewitnesses who are all verifying the same story over and over again of who Jesus is, that he was powerful pre-resurrection, and that they even saw him post-resurrection. There's actually a list laid out in 1 Corinthians 15 of all of the post-resurrection appearances, at least the ones that Paul knows about. I'd say it's a pretty definitive list. I don't have anything else to say about it. But you have a picture of Jesus as he has shown himself to others. I handed down to you in verse 3, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3, I handed down to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom remain until now, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. What you have here is a picture in 1 Corinthians 15 of Jesus appearing to plenty of people. It's not just Paul who says, I saw Jesus. I know he's dead, but I saw him post-resurrection. You have Peter who says, I know he died, but I saw him post-resurrection. You have all the apostles who say, I know he died, but we saw him post-resurrection. It's more than that. You have James, the Lord's brother, who saw him post-resurrection. By the way, the brothers of Jesus didn't believe in Jesus while he was alive normally here on the earth. Back in the Gospels, you see them ridiculing and mocking him, trying to lock him up because he's insane. Only after Jesus rose again do you see his mother and his brothers actually form a part of the church and be believers in really who he is. We have a lot of evidence. It goes beyond just the inner circle of the apostles, more than 500 at one time, some of whom have fallen asleep or died, but most of them are still around, and they can bear witness to the fact that Jesus has returned. We have all this eyewitness testimony of people who have seen Jesus. Do you want to say that 500 people at one time all mass hallucinated that Jesus appeared? Or do you want to say, well, that doesn't normally happen, but maybe it could in this one very odd circumstance? If you presuppose that miracles can't exist, you presuppose that Jesus cannot have risen from the dead. Therefore, you have to come up with an explanation, like mass hallucination, for all these people seeing Jesus. But of course, mass hallucination isn't real. It's not scientific. It doesn't happen, etc., etc. It's just as much of a miracle for 500 people to mass hallucinate Jesus as it would be for Jesus to rise from the dead. That's something you have to grapple with. Eyewitness testimony. One man by himself, not necessarily reliable. 500 plus, that starts to be pretty reliable. What do you believe? How do you prove the supernatural? A lot of people saw something happen, and we know it can't exist, but it did anyway. And that starts to be proof that something did actually happen. There are also, here's the other side of things, and here's, maybe this is the more convincing argument, the otherwise inexplicable change in physical circumstances, exemplified primarily here by Paul's life. I saw a revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay? Or you think you did, right? If we distrust Paul, fine. I guess you think you saw the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, what did that actually mean for you? It means his entire life changed. And that's what you see in verses 13 through 17. It's really the rest of the chapter, but you see it, especially here. Verse 14, Paul says in verse 13, I had my former way of life in Judaism. I used to be a Jew, then I saw Jesus, and now I'm a Christian. I used to persecute the church of God. Then I saw Jesus, and now I'm a Christian. I tried to destroy it, but then I saw Jesus, and now I try to build it up. In verse 14, I was advancing in Judaism better than everybody else, beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen. I was more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. If you know the life of Paul, Paul's career was going really well. Go read Acts chapter, the very tail end of chapter 7. Saul of Tarsus is the one who's holding the coats of the men who stoned Stephen. He's giving hearty approval to it. Saul, in the first few verses of Acts chapter 8, is hunting down the church. He's breaking into people's houses. He's dragging them off to prison to try and get them killed. In Acts chapter 9, he's chasing Christians all the way to a different country. He's going to the country of Syria, to Damascus, to go and combat Christians over there. He's doing really well for himself. He's a Pharisee of Pharisees. You can read lists later on in, I believe it's 2 Corinthians 11, that lists out all his accomplishments and who he used to be under the old life of Judaism. He's advancing in Judaism faster than his contemporaries. Yeah, he's a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's a Jew of Jews, of Abraham's children. They're Abraham's children. I'm Abraham's child, I'm the best that there was, is what he says. I was more zealous. I was more encouraged. I was more enthusiastic. I was more effective than anybody else in Judaism. And then suddenly it all changes. How many people do you know that have a very successful business plan and then they just kind of throw it all away? How many people do you know have a very successful career and then they decide to just up and change everything and leave that for something else? The Pharisee business is very successful. The Pharisee business is very lucrative. It's very profitable. Why would Paul want to get rid of that? That's a question you have to ask. Is Paul trustworthy that he saw Jesus? Well, one question you'd have to ask on the other side of that, why would Paul lie that he saw Jesus? What does he get out of lying about Jesus? What does he get out of making up a story about seeing Jesus and then converting to Christianity? Does Paul's life get simpler when he converts to Christianity? No. Go read the New Testament, right? No, not at all. Of course not. Life is not going to get simple when you convert to Christianity. In many ways, life gets more difficult. Life doesn't get easy for him. Back in those days, you had the Roman Empire, and they were one thing, and then you had the Jews as a part of that, and of course there are many other national groups as well. But the Romans and the Jews really didn't like each other. The Jews especially hated the Romans. Romans came in, they had taken over, we don't approve of that here. The Jews formed their own communities. In many cases, the Romans didn't care about the Jews very much. They didn't really involve them in the overarching community, and so the Jews joined their own communities. What happens when, like Paul, you take Judaism and then you convert away from Judaism to Christianity? Well, you get cut out of the Jewish circles, and now you're not Jewish either. The Romans hate you because you're ethnically Jewish, but the Jews hate you because you're religiously Christian. Now everybody hates you. Does your life get simpler when you convert to Christianity? Does Paul's life get easier? Not at all. Why would he lie about that and make things more difficult for himself? Well, some people are willing to make things difficult for themselves to get rich, right? To benefit physically from all of these things. People will take on a higher level in a company, or they'll go up to manager, right? That means more work, that means more effort, that means more hours put in, but it also means a higher paycheck. So maybe Paul's doing this to get paid more. No, right? How did Paul ever get rich off of this? Even go back to any of the apostles, right? Why would any of the apostles lie for this? This did not benefit anyone physically. These men were poor. They were travelers. Paul used to live in Jerusalem and be, the rising star. He used to be famous. He used to be relatively well off. The Pharisees were rich people. He probably had quite a bit of physical resources. And then he converts to Christianity. What happens? Well, he can't live in Jerusalem anymore. He alludes to it in verse 18, he goes up to Jerusalem for a bit. Then in verse 21, he goes away into Syria and Cilicia. You know why that happened? It's in Acts chapter 9. Paul is being a faithful preacher. He goes to Jerusalem. He starts preaching, and the people there hate him so much they try and kill him. So he's sent away to Syria to protect himself. Well, okay. What did Paul get out of this? What physical benefit did Paul get out of this? Of course, he gets nothing. Is he more comfortable when he becomes a Christian? No. Is he better off physically when he becomes a Christian? No. Why is he converting? What natural way do you have to explain why Paul is converting to Christianity? You don't have one. It's not that he's crazy. People who are crazy, maybe, but it's not that he's crazy. He's too logical for that. Read any of his books. You know he's thought all of this through. Why is he converting to Christianity? How are you going to explain that? The case for Christianity being something from God and being a revelation of Jesus Christ is made very strongly when you look at Paul's life. Paul had everything and he gave it all up. so that he could be a Christian. That doesn't make sense unless something happened to him, unless he saw something that changed his mind so thoroughly. When you look at Paul's life, it's clear that he was a witness to something beyond the realm of normality. Even if you don't believe in the supernatural, you have to explain this away, and you can't. If you don't believe in the supernatural, why would any of them do it? Paul gave up a life of comfort and ease to a life where he would be on the road forever, where the longest he ever stayed in a place was 3 years, except for Rome, where he was thrown in prison. He was in and out of prisons. He was beaten several times over. He was shipwrecked several times over. He got deathly ill on at least one occasion, presumably. There's so much more. Everything he went through, only to eventually get his head cut off because he was a Christian, and he wouldn't stop being a Christian. Why would Paul do all that and give himself up if he didn't see something? Why would Peter do all that and give himself up if he didn't see something? Do you know that of the 13 apostles with Paul, 12 of them were executed ultimately? Why do people do that? You don't do that to believe a lie, right? There was I forget exactly who said this. Someone came to Christ because they saw the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal, 12 men couldn't keep a secret for 2 weeks. And then the Bible talks about 12 men who allegedly lied about Jesus and then kept that secret for 40, 50 years, 60, 100 years, until all of them were executed and killed for it. Now, people don't act like that. How do you explain the inexplicable? You can't. Unless there's something mysterious that God did behind the scenes. Paul's life is clear. He saw something. And he's living proof of the gospel message. That Jesus came and died and rose again. He appeared to Paul. He made an impression. And Paul starts going to listen to Jesus instead. He saw Jesus. He listened to Jesus. He spent time with Jesus. There's a mention in verse 17. He went away into Arabia. That's not covered in the book of Acts, but it does seem Arabia being the big desert nearby Damascus. As soon as he converts to Christianity, he goes out in the desert for a while. It's interesting. Jesus started off his ministry in Matthew 4, right? He's baptized in Matthew 3. He then goes out into the wilderness in Matthew 4 to be tempted by the devil. So it seems like Paul was doing a similar thing, or maybe he went out into the wilderness to be with God and be taught by God. One requirement of being an apostle, if you go back to Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, when Peter is addressing the group, he says, we need to pick an apostle to replace Judas. We need someone who has witnessed Jesus all throughout. Maybe Paul was doing some of that in the wilderness, going and living with Jesus, beginning his ministry by praying in the desert and working with him. The point of all of this is, look, Paul gave his life to this endeavor. That's not something you would do. Maybe if you were very poor, maybe if this was the only way out, maybe you might do that. He wasn't poor. He wasn't needy. He had a very secure job. He was doing a great work. He was very, very faithful. He was absolutely committed. And then one day, he's not anymore. What broke Paul from that? Paul's life is the reality of Jesus' resurrection. It is the gospel. That God's story, Jesus' story, can take one person who is so dead set in his ways and change his mind to make him dead set in the other way. God's story, it's a miracle, quite frankly. It's a change that we would not normally expect. It can't happen by natural means. It's supernatural. And that's what Paul is. That's what Paul's life is. It's proof of the gospel. It's the case for the gospel. It shows the power of the gospel. And that leads us to point number 3, which is the change that the gospel brings about. There is a claim that the gospel is from God. How do you see that? Well, there's the case that Paul saw something from God, and it's called the gospel. It changed his mind, and it put him in the right way. And you see that change manifest itself, right? That's point 3. It's the change, verses 18 through 24. When the gospel enters Paul's life, everything changes for him. When God's power gets its hooks in, nothing can ever be the same again. And so you see that Paul changes his faith in verse 23. He used to be in Judaism, verse 13, verse 14, verse 23. He used to be in Judaism and persecute the faith. And now his faith has changed. Now his faith is in the very thing he tried to destroy back in the day. He's no longer Jewish. Now he's Christian. He's no longer rejecting Jesus. Now he's really understanding what the Old Testament meant the whole time. He no longer has his hope built in the temple or in the Messiah that is to come, because he knows that the Messiah already has come. He sees the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He finally understands everything now that he's in Christianity. His faith has changed. And the power of the gospel is such that it can change someone's faith. It can fix their worldview. You come to this life, everybody through a mix of circumstances or experiences or whatever it is, finds themselves in a different place. Some people are atheists. They don't like God actively. They don't believe in him. Some people are agnostic. They just aren't really sure. Some people are religious of various stripes. Some people are even various flavors of Christian. Everybody comes to adulthood with a variety of different beliefs and a variety of different experiences that have informed the things that they actually trust in. The gospel, the power of God, the story of Jesus is more than that. The story of Jesus comes out of the text and it enters a person's life, and it can unify people like nothing else can. The church is made up not just of, it's not a bunch of copies of the same type of person. The church has people from all different areas of the world, from all different kinds of backgrounds, from all different ages, from all different backgrounds and sorts of life, all different careers, all different castes or levels of society. Very rich people, very poor people, very smart people, very dumb people, very whatever people, men and women, young and old, etc., etc. The church unifies. How can it do that? Because it changes someone's faith. And it changes your basic worldview, and it brings you back to God and to reality. The gospel has power. The gospel doesn't end just in a book. The gospel comes into your life, and it starts to make changes. God does not override your free will. You can hear all these things about the gospel and absolutely reject it. God's fine with that. Well, he allows it to happen. He's not happy about it, but you get to make your own choice. Ultimately, though, the gospel will change those who are willing to listen to it. And the gospel can change your faith if you want it to. The gospel also changes your work. In verse 23, again, the man who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he tried to destroy. Paul used to be a diehard Jew, now he's a diehard Christian. Paul used to be a diehard Jew, and being, by the way, a diehard Jew means you want to exterminate Christianity because you think it's evil and you think it's blasphemous. He used to be that. But after meeting God and after seeing God and after experiencing the gospel, seeing the story of Jesus before his eyes, that Jesus is in fact alive, that comes into him, that changes him. Now he's a diehard Christian, and he pursues his faith. He preaches that faith. He used to work directly against God, now he works directly for God. The gospel changes your work. A lot of people, when they do such blatant evil against God, if they do come around to Christianity, they do repent and they just kind of want to hide themselves away. Paul doesn't do that. Paul changes his work. He's no longer fighting against God. Now he's not only cool with God, now he's working for God. And so it's encouraging to see that. The gospel shows us what's really important. And the gospel asks us to make those changes. Change what you do. Change what you believe, change what you do. That's the power that Jesus' story has. That's the power of the gospel. And thirdly, Paul changes his audience. In verse 24, they were glorifying God because of me. The people who hear of Paul's story, the people even just like you and me in the modern day, they see Paul's changes. We see Paul's changes. And we realize he saw something. We realize he is proof of the gospel. And we can start to make our own changes based on that. When you see the gospel work in someone's life, it is encouraging, it is inspiring, it is life-altering. Because if God can fix that person, God can fix you too. And that's the picture we have. Even today, we take inspiration from Paul's conversion. Paul is, as he says himself, he is the chief of sinners. But even the chief of sinners can be forgiven. That's the power of the gospel. And so Paul makes some changes. God makes some changes to Paul to fix him, to bring him around to righteousness. And that's ultimately what secures his salvation. What is this gospel? Wrapping up here, it's not just a book. Some people think it's just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not just those. It's not just merely a book. It's not merely the story of Jesus. That's where it begins, but that's far from where it ends. The gospel is, as Paul says in Romans chapter 1, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. It's not from man. Man didn't make it up. It's God's call to man, and what a call it actually is. It's not merely a story. It begins in a story. It begins with the story of Christ, but it turns into something else. Because once Christ gets his ideas into you, suddenly you start thinking differently, and suddenly you start acting differently, and suddenly you start realizing how messed up you are and how much you need him. When Jesus actually gets his hooks in you, you have to convert to the gospel. And that's why Jesus said it best. In Mark 1 and verse 15, he said, "The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." Not believe in the book of Mark, not believe in the story of Christ, but believe in what Jesus has done and what he continues to do through you. That's what the gospel is. It's more than just a story. The gospel is the change that it enacts in someone's life. So, hopefully that makes you think of something useful. Hopefully that, if you're still watching, hopefully that's not too offensive against, Mormons or Muslims or atheists or whoever it is. I'm just trying to speak what God has said. And so God is pretty clear on that. He's laid out the gospel. It's open for you. You can listen to it if you want to, but that's ultimately going to be your choice. So thank you for listening. Hopefully that's useful. And I am not preaching on Sunday night this week, so I will not have anything coming out on Friday, but I am preaching a class on Sunday, or I'm teaching a class on Sunday morning, starting in Daniel chapter 6. I preached Daniel 1 through 5 earlier. Don't have recordings here for that, but I am doing a class on Daniel 6, and so that'll come out. I'll probably publish that Wednesday morning along with my notes for that. So if that's interesting to you, hopefully you stick around. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed, hope you benefited, and I will see you all next time.